From the swirling chaos of creation to the dawn of humanity in a pristine garden.
Welcome. You re-invited to leave behind the noise of the present and step into a story that has endured for millennia. A story written by kings and shepherds, prophets and fishermen. A story whispered across deserts, spoken in temples, and pondered in the stillness of candlelit monasteries. As you relax, let your breath settle. Imagine yourself there, among the early wanderers, where the rhythm of their lives moved to the rising and setting of the sun, where the winds carried more than dust, they carried promise. Let your muscles soften. Let your thoughts gently drift into the ancient rhythm of a sacred story that begins not with chaos, but with purpose. This is not simply a book. It's a tapestry, a quiet, unfolding journey of love, struggle, redemption, and hope. Tonight, we begin with the gentle patterns of daily life in the world of Genesis. Now, Segment 1, Daily Life Immersion. In the time of the patriarchs, imagine the soft crunch of sand underfoot as dawn stretches over the ancient hills of Canaan. This is the world of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. A world not of cities, but of tents, of herds and flocks, of watchful skies and whispered prayers by firelight. The people of this world lived closely with the land. Their tents were woven from goat hair, their days marked by the soft clinking of bronze tools and the murmur of livestock. God walked in gardens, spoke in dreams, appeared in the heat of the day. Faith was not ritual, it was relationship. The covenant, like a whispered vow, passed from generation to generation. Water was precious. Drawn from deep wells, it was often a place of both survival. You listen to the quiet bleating of goats nearby. In the stillness, you sense the weight of something ancient, something eternal. The aroma of baking mingled with the scent of sheep and earth, grounding them in both toil and grace. There was hardship, yes, drought, hunger, the loss of children. But there was also laughter. The laughter of Sarah, surprised by joy. The laughter of Isaac, whose name would forever echo that disbelief turned delight. And in contrast with Rebekah and Eliezer, where one simple act of kindness would shape generations to come. Life was slow, deliberate. There were no walls of stone to divide them, only the openness of the horizon. Each morning began with the tending of flocks, and each evening closed with the telling of stories, genealogies remembered, promises repeated. Sons were taught the stories of their fathers, and daughters carried the rhythms of home. Meals were simple: roasted grain, fresh goat milk, bread kneaded by hand. Religion wasn't confined to buildings. Altars were built with uncut stones, and prayers rose on the wind. Imagine yourself by a well, the stone still damp with morning dew. And as the day passes into twilight, we now move from the rhythm of life to the life of one man whose journey would shape not just his family, but the future of nations. Segment 2. Biography. Event. The life of Joseph. Dreams, exile, and destiny. Imagine a quiet morning on the edge of a valley. The mist still clings to the lowlands, and a solitary young man walks among the hills, his multicolored robe catching the light of the rising sun. His father loved him more than his brothers and gave him a robe of many colors, simple gift, yet a symbol that stirred bitterness. Not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to forget. He worked in a house of Potiphar, adapting to new customs, new language, new gods that were not his own. And yet, something within him remained steadfast. He did not break. He rose to favor, but favor would not last. Falsely accused, he was imprisoned. His cries echoed softly as they sat to eat nearby. But there is no wrath, no punishment, only tears, only reconciliation. Eventually, he was sold exchange for a silver led away in chains to a foreign land. The rhythm of his life had changed into the sacred echoes of hidden writings and ancient revelations. His journey reminds us that even in exile, even in the most unlikely places, purpose can unfold. Joseph dreamt strange dreams, stalks of wheat bowing, stars and celestial bodies paying homage. To his brothers, this was not prophecy, was arrogance. And one quiet afternoon, in the solitude of the fields, resentment became action. This is Joseph, the favored son of Jacob. Born into a family of shepherds, his story begins not with power, but with dreams. Joseph's early life, though wrapped in affection, was shadowed by jealousy. They cast him into a pit. Now in Egypt, Joseph's days became a quiet repetition of servitude. Imagine the cold of the stone floor beneath him, the low murmur of other prisoners, the scent of damp straw. In the stillness of confinement, Joseph dreamt again not for himself, but for others. He interpreted dreams for men who could not understand their visions. And when his brothers, those same men who once threw him into darkness, came seeking grain, he saw them not with vengeance, but with quiet recognition. In time, the Pharaoh heard of this gift and summoned Joseph to his court. From prisoner to advisor, from exile to power, the rhythm of his life, once stripped of everything familiar, found a new cadence in the halls of Egypt. Yet Joseph never forgot. When famine gripped the region, it was he who held the keys to survival. There is a moment, soft and long awaited, when Joseph reveals himself. His voice breaks the silence. I am Joseph, your brother. Joseph's life was one of detours and delays, of dreams deferred but never destroyed. Now, as we step softly away from the court of Pharaoh and the grain stores of Egypt. Let us journey deeper into a realm not of memory, but of mystery. Segment 3: Mystery, Archaeology, Culture, Hidden Treasures in Banned Texts. Now, imagine yourself in a quiet, dimly lit chamber. The air is thick with age and dust. Around you, scrolls and fragments lie scattered, some crumbling, others remarkably preserved. Though not included in the canon of most traditions, the book was once read and revered, even quoted in the New Testament. Its language is vivid, yet its tone is solemn. It speaks of stars that disobey their orbits, of secrets shown to men not meant to see. It offers a calendar, a structure, an order to sacred history. Some found comfort in its details, others discomfort in its rigid cycles. But even in its strange imagery, it carries a familiar rhythm, one of longing, of order, of return. The ink, thick and deliberate. The parchment, stretched and smoothed. These writings were not created for spectacle. At a cosmos trembling with movement, judgment, and grace. At a divine realm, watching, waiting, whispering across time. They were meant to be contemplated, to be pondered in solitude. The flicker of oil lamps casting soft shadows on stone. You sense something sacred. We gently close the scrolls and step away from the vaults of mystery. Returning now to the world above, ground where kings ruled, scribes recorded, and the contrast between the powerful and the ordinary became all too clear. Not threatening, not forbidden, just unfinished. Yet their preservation in caves and jars in places like Qumran, near the Dead Sea, suggests they were once held close, copied by hand, read in the hush of twilight. These are not the familiar texts of Sunday sermons or schoolroom study. There are no miracles here, no crucifixion, no resurrection, just parables and riddles meant to be pondered in silence. The kingdom of God is inside you. One verse whispers, and all around you. Not a contradiction of Scripture, but perhaps a mirror held up from a different angle. These are the lost voices, the whispered writings, the forgotten echoes of early faith, the banned texts. Among them, the Book of Enoch. Its pages speak of watchers, celestial beings who descend to earth, of giants born from forbidden unions, of cosmic rebellion and divine judgment. Beside it lies the Gospel of Thomas, a slender collection of sayings attributed to Jesus. Then there is the Book of Jubilees, a retelling of Genesis and Exodus filled with precise timelines and angelic commentary. These texts were not all condemned for heresy. Some simply faded, deemed unnecessary, or too mystical, or too bold. Imagine the care with which each word was etched, the quiet reverence of the scribe, And while not part of official canon, these texts expand the atmosphere of the biblical world. They hint at spiritual battles not often seen, as you rest among these forgotten scrolls. And with that, Segment 4, Social, Elite, Contrasting Daily Life, Prophets and Palaces. Voices of God amid thrones of men. Now, imagine stone steps worn smooth by centuries of sandals. Torches flicker in iron brackets. And ahead, the imposing figure of a palace rises built, not only to house rulers, but to remind the world of who held power. This is where kings lived, where scribes recorded, where decrees were etched in wax and stone. In ancient Israel and Judah, palaces were centers of control, order, and display. In the courts of rulers, they were both feared and dismissed, tolerated for their insights, but rarely welcomed. Walls were painted with rich dyes, floors lined with patterned tiles. They confronted corruption, they exposed false worship, and most dangerously, they spoke truth to power. Yet their words weren't always rebukes. The elite surrounded themselves with yes men. The prophet often stood alone. A palace feast might overflow with roasted lamb, seasoned oils, and wine. Yet, through the prophet, the message was the same. God does not dwell in stone alone. The sun is low. The crowd gathers, half curious, half skeptical, and in a voice steady and serene, he asks, "What does the Lord require of you?" From the dust of patriarchs to the halls of mystery, from wilderness prophets to royal courts, the Bible's story has only just begun. Let the quiet settle around you as we continue, but to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. He walks with the humble. He hears the oppressed. He searches the heart. In the village, a mother ground barley by hand, baked coarse bread on a clay oven, and offered a silent prayer over each child's portion. And yet, over time, it was not the names of the rulers that echoed across generations, but the words of the prophets preserved, repeated, not to kings alone, but to you. They offered comfort to, like Jeremiah, who wept for a city under siege, whispering hope in the midst of ruin. Or Amos, a shepherd turned prophet who envisioned justice rolling like a river. Courtyards bustled with servants, soldiers, advisors. And yet, amid this orchestrated life of the elite, a different voice could often be heard. Not dressed in fine linen, not speaking with rehearsed eloquence, but raw, relentless, reverent. These were the prophets. While kings like Solomon sat upon thrones carved from ivory, prophets like Elijah wandered in the wilderness, clothed in rough garments, fed by ravens. Imagine Isaiah walking into a royal chamber, his feet dusty, his eyes unwavering. he speaks not for himself, but for God. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. The room stills. No one moves. The king shifts in his seat. Prophets were not political. They were personal. The social contrast was profound. Kings measured success in borders and tribute. Prophets measured it in righteousness. In daily life, the contrast could not have been clearer. Even temple rituals divided people. The high priest entered the Holy of Holies once a year. Most would never see beyond the outer court. So imagine now the prophet Micah standing not in a palace, but in the market square. As the crowd disperses, the sun slipping beneath the hills, we are left with that question not shouted, but spoken gently. And now, let us rest a moment as we prepare to re-enter this story. Segment 5. From Eden to Exile. Humanity's journey. Let us begin once again in a garden. Imagine a place untouched by hardship. The air is still and fragrant. The ground soft beneath your feet. Rivers glimmer under dappled light. Trees rise in quiet majesty, their leaves murmuring in a language only the wind understands. This is Eden, not just a location, but a symbol, a rhythm before disruption, a peace before the fall. In this garden walked the first humans, that lives were simple, yet sacred. They tilled, they named, they rested. They were not alone. God walked with them in the cool of the day. No temple was needed. The garden itself was holy. But like so many sacred things, the peace was fragile. Not because he did not know, but because they no longer did. A choice was made, a fruit taken. The tower at Babel, brick upon brick, reaching toward heaven, only to be scattered by confusion. Kings rose: Saul, David, Solomon, and then fell. The kingdom split. Prophets warned. Exile returned. A command broken. The prophets spoke of return, of restoration, of a Messiah to come. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? They asked. A moment when judgment came, but so did hope. And so began the slow descent from Eden to exile. Imagine the rustle of leaves as they hid in shame, the hush that fell when the voice of God called out, "Where are you?" From that moment on, humanity wandered. Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood. In the barren hills of Ur, God called a man named Abram. "Go," he said, "to a land I will show you." And with that, the covenant began. Not with grandeur, but with quiet faith. With steps into the unknown. And yet, through each exile, there came a whisper of redemption. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 sons. The famine, Egypt. Centuries passed. The Hebrew people grew numerous in a land not their own. And when the time came, God called again, this time from a burning bush. Moses, once a prince, now a shepherd, turned toward the flame. "Take off your sandals," the voice said, "for you are standing on holy ground." Thus began the journey to freedom. Plagues, partings, wilderness, the 10 Commandments, the tabernacle in the desert, a moving sanctuary. But old habits are hard to leave behind. Idols re-emerged. Complaints replaced gratitude. And when they reached the promised land, fear delayed entry. The pattern repeats. Trust, rebellion. Faith, fear. Imagine a people weeping by the rivers of Babylon, their songs silenced, their hearts heavy. Yet, even there, in captivity, the promise endured. From Eden's stillness to Babylon's lament, the journey is long, winding, broken, but never abandoned. Now, as the exiles return, rebuilding walls and rediscovering words long lost, we step quietly into the next story of mercy, of water, of rainbow. Segment 6. The Flood and God's Mercy. Imagine the sound of rain, not a gentle tapping on rooftops, but a steady, relentless rhythm to build, to believe. Not just battles, but the quiet, kind betrayals. Greed, cruelty, disguised as power. And in this, God was grieved. Not in anger alone, but in sorrow. A sorrow that washed over the world in the form of a flood. At first, just drops, then sheets, then torrents. The skies opened, the earth groaned, and the world, as it was, began to change. This is the story of Noah, a man who, in a time when wickedness had spread like a shadow across the earth, chose to listen. Imagine the Labor Day shaping beams, sealing seams with pitch, under a sky still clear in a land far from water. Noah was not a preacher of fire, but of faith. He built while others laughed. He gathered animals 2 by 2. He waited for rain no one believed would fall. In the days of Noah, violence filled the land. But before judgment came a call. Build an ark, God said. Outside, the world was being made new by water. And then it began. The heavens wept. The earth split. The waters rose. For now, we turn from ancient floods to a mission that reaches every shore, from a carpenter's final command to the footsteps of those who followed. Inside the ark, imagine the stillness, the low breathing of animals, the creak of wood, the anxious silence of a family enclosed in faith. But this was not destruction for the sake of punishment. It was cleansing, recreation, a return to formlessness so that form might emerge again. A soft arch of color stretched across the sky, like a bow hung up laid aside, a sign of peace. After 40 days, the rain stopped. The ark rested, the door opened. Noah planted a vineyard. His sons stumbled. Like the rain returned, but so did grace. Then came the rainbow, not just a natural wonder, but a covenant, a sacred restraint. There, the cause is more than human corruption. It speaks of celestial beings, watchers who descended, broke divine boundaries, and taught forbidden knowledge. It adds cosmic weight to Noah's story, framing it not just as a tale of water and wood, but of war between realms. And yet, the story did not end in perfection. In later writings, especially in the Book of Enoch, an ancient text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the story of the flood deepens. Whether one embraces these extra writings or not, the heart of the story remains. God judges, but he also saves. So, as the rainbow fades into mist and the ark becomes just wood once more, we are reminded that the arc of the Bible bends not toward destruction, but toward redemption. Let the waters settle in your mind. Let the hush return. Segment 7. The Great Commission. Your role in God's plan. Imagine a quiet hillside just outside the city of Jerusalem. The dust has settled from recent days of darkness, of stone rolled away, of trembling hearts made whole again. A small group gathers. Their teacher, once crucified, now stands before them, not in a blaze of glory, but with calm authority, as if time itself bends gently around him. This is the moment of the Great Commission. Jesus speaks, not with force, but with clarity. Go, he says, and make disciples of all nations. Not just an instruction, but an invitation, a beginning. From this soft command, history shifted, not through war, not through politics, but through the footsteps of ordinary people moved by extraordinary love. From Jerusalem to Judea, to Samaria, and then beyond, to Greece, to Rome, to the farthest edge of their world. Imagine fishermen once bound to the tides of Galilee, now crossing seas to distant shores. Tent makers, tax collectors, women once silenced now, proclaiming hope in city squares, synagogues, and hidden homes. They carried no swords, only stories. They did not build empires, but communities. The early church, fragile and fiery, spread not through power, but through presence, imprisonment, mockery, death. But always it grew. At first, there were whispers in markets, quiet baptisms by rivers, or Peter walking the very streets that once condemned him, now speaking with renewed strength, and the sound of their sandals echoes in the silence. We prepare to meet others, those often overlooked, yet profoundly faithful. Women whose names were rarely shouted, but whose lives shaped the very core of the gospel story. Letters passed from house to house, words of encouragement, of warning, of deep, persistent faith. Over time, their movement faced trials. The Roman roads, once built to serve Caesar's empire, became the paths by which the gospel traveled. Sometimes it is across a table, a hallway, a border drawn not by maps but by misunderstanding. Imagine Paul writing by lamplight in a prison cell, or Lydia opening her home to strangers. Each played a part. And what of today? The command remains. Go, but not always far. Sometimes the journey is inward. Your role in God's plan may not involve pulpits or foreign lands. It may be as quiet as listening, as steady as kindness, as enduring as prayer. The Great Commission is not just a task, it is a rhythm, a heartbeat passed from generation to generation, a whisper that becomes a wave. And so, as the early church fades into the pages of history, Segment 8, Women of Faith, Unsung Heroes of the Gospel, imagine a quiet courtyard. The morning sun stretching across smooth stone. Somewhere nearby, bread is baking. A child's laughter rings out. And at the edge of it all stands a woman, her hands folded, her eyes watching. Not commanding armies, not ruling from thrones, but steady, present, faithful. Throughout the Bible, women moved quietly through the margins, and yet their presence shaped the very heartbeat of the sacred story. There is Mary, a young girl from Nazareth. She followed Jesus when others fled. She stood at the foot of the cross when the world went silent. And on the third day, it was she, not Peter, not James, who first saw the empty tomb. Go and tell, the angel said, and she did. She became the first witness of the resurrection. Her world was small, her life ordinarian, till an angel appeared. Do not be afraid, he said. And though she did not understand, she answered with courage, let it be to me according to your word. In fields, walking with children. In city streets, whispering stories of Jesus to neighbors. Their lives were not loud, but they were luminous. A grandmother who prayed quietly, a friend who listens with unusual depth. Or perhaps you see yourself. She carried not just a child, but a promise. In her womb grew the fulfillment of centuries. It is one of invitation. And these women remind us that the gospel moves not just through leaders and preachers, a final book rich in symbolism, trembling with promise, revelation, but through anyone who is willing to say yes. Alongside her husband Aquila, she helped disciple one of the early church's most eloquent preachers. Imagine her walking to Bethlehem, the ache of late pregnancy, the uncertainty of each step, giving birth not in silk sheets, but in straw. Yet she sang, lullaby to the world. Then Mary Magdalene, whose past was shadowed, but whose future was luminous. Further along the story, we find Priscilla, a tent maker like Paul, who taught and debated with grace and authority. A deacon, entrusted with the delivery of Paul's letter to the Romans, laterally the most theologically rich letter in the New Testament. She did not just carry parchment, she carried theology, truth, a message to the heart of the empire. The woman at the well, whose encounter with Jesus turned her into a messenger for her village. The woman who touched the hem of his garment, healed not just in body, but in hope. Then there were the unnamed widow with 2 coins, whose quiet offering became an eternal lesson in trust. These women lived in a world that often muted their voices, yet the gospel amplified them. Imagine them in dim rooms, breaking bread with believers. Their faith was not displayed on stages, but lived out in homes, in markets, in moments. As you reflect on these women, perhaps you see someone you know. The story of the Bible is not one of hierarchy. Now, as their stories gently settle in your mind, we prepare to gaze ahead toward visions, not of the past, but of what is to come. Segment 9. Revelation's Hope. A glorious future awaits. Imagine a sky not bound by clouds, but by light colors not seen in the world we know. Sounds like rushing waters mingled with the hum of eternity. This is Revelation, the final book, the final vision, the gentle closing of a vast and sacred story. Penned by the Apostle John in exile on the island of Patmos, Revelation does not begin with fear. It begins with a voice, like a trumpet, calling out to one man, alone on a rocky shore. Write what you see. What he saw was not merely prophecy. It was a curtain pulled back, and at its banks, the tree of life, once guarded by angels, now offered freely. Hope that evil does not get the final word. That brokenness will be mended, that what was lost in Eden will be restored in a new garden, in a new city, where God dwells again with His people. A glimpse into both suffering and triumph. A world trembling, yet held in divine hands. A reminder that the chaos of the present is not the end. That even when the world shakes, there is one who holds it steady. There are symbols, beasts and bulls, trumpets and seals. But beneath the imagery lies something soft and certain. Hope. Imagine that city. Streets like Golnot for luxury, but for light. Gates never closed. A river, clear as crystal, flowing from the throne. In this city, there are no more tears, no more mourning, no more death, for the former things have passed away. The voice that speaks is not distant, it is near, gentle. Behold, it says, I make all things new. Revelation is not just about judgment. It is a lullaby for the weary. In the final pages, the church is not scattered. It is gathered, a bride adorned, a people made whole, a story completed. And so, as you let these images settle in your mind, the throne, the river, the city of light, you are invited not to escape reality, but to remember that it is not yet finished. The promise remains. And now, we gently close the book. Conclusion: join the story. God's invitation to you and now. Dear listener, as you rest beneath the weight of this ancient narrative, let your breath slow. Let your thoughts soften. You have walked through gardens and deserts, stood at the foot of altars and arks, glimpsed thrones and whispered prayers. It speaks not only of kings and prophets, but of wanderers, of mothers, of craftsmen and dreamers, of people much like you, shaped by fear, stirred by hope, and searching for something more. And perhaps, most gently of all, you've realized this story is not just about them. It is also about you. It tells us that beyond the flood, there is always a rainbow. Not as a spectator, but as one invited to step in, to live kindly, to walk humbly, to share the light you've been given. Beyond the cross, there's always an empty tomb. And beyond this life, this fragile, flickering life, there is always eternity. From the first pages of Genesis to the final promises of Revelation, the Bible does not shout its invites. Or perhaps you will simply carry its rhythm into your day, the stillness of Eden, the courage of Esther, the tears of Joseph, the fire of Pentecost. They are not distant, they are near. It speaks of a Creator who does not forget, of covenants that do not break, of mercy that reaches even into exile. So now, imagine yourself standing quietly at the edge of that story. A story of love, of promise, of God. You are not too late. The ink is not yet dry. Your chapter, too, is being written. Perhaps tomorrow, you will pick up the book again. And as your thoughts drift gently into sleep, let one truth remain softly with you, and may peace, like a river, gently carry you into rest. You belong to a story that began before time and will continue beyond it. Good night.